Good afternoon to you. Mark Sutton of HurricaneTrack.com here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion. It is Tuesday, January 14th, 2020. Hope you're having a good afternoon. It is nice and warm across much of the southeast United States. Record temperatures. No sign of winter yet, but I think that's going to be coming for the east and the northeast and the nation's midsection. We will take a look at that towards the end of today's video. The first part of these Outlook videos during the off-season months of December through roughly May is dedicated to some of the climate puzzle pieces that we watch. You know, the sea surface temperature anomalies. What's the state of the El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon, or simply put, El Nino? Are we going to have one? Are we not going to have one? You know, just different things that we can monitor on a weekly basis that kind of gives us something to do in the off season as we wait and see what happens with next year's, well, it's already next year, but the upcoming hurricane season. No hurricanes to worry about out there right now. A quick look at the visible satellite animation here, courtesy of Tropical Tidbits. Nice brisk flow going through the Caribbean with the trade winds. You guys have had some exceptionally windy conditions, some larger than normal surf down there in the Virgin Islands, the north-facing beach areas of the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, where you're enduring those earthquakes. My goodness. That's on the south side, though. And then, again, through the British Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, some of the Northeast Caribbean, other islands over here. Why have you been having that? Well, very, very strong high pressure. One of our patrons, one of our supporters, Howard, from Bermuda, was talking about this the other day on our chat, that it's like exceptionally nice weather or something like that. This very strong high-pressure area has been settled in across the western Atlantic, and that has done a couple things. It creates this gradient of strong wind, and that's keeping the trades pretty brisk, and it keeps the waves up. It also keeps the cold air at bay. It's all locked up here over northern Canada, and just the overall pattern is very similar to summer, with like this big Bermuda high sitting out here, troughiness kind of out west, and to some extent. But bottom line is, it's been a very unusual weather pattern. Very warm in the east, kind of cold in the west, but no major storm systems, no big winter storms just yet. At least along the east coast, most of the winter weather has been confined up here to the nation's northern states, etc. Maybe out in the Rockies and the Sierra, where you're getting a good snowpack built up. Looking down in the tropics, as I mentioned, though, brisk trade winds coming through, just the occasional pop-up air mass shower or thunderstorm from time to time. Another one of our supporters, Brent, down in St. John, telling me that there was some lightning in some of those pop-up storms this morning. Notice here, this will be interesting as we progress through January into February, the subtropical jet, nice and active, transporting moisture out of the southeast Pacific into the lower 48 across Mexico. And if we get cold air to come down in mass, in other words, more than just a brief shot of it, then maybe we could have some winter weather action along the east coast and elsewhere. But until that happens, the two getting intermixed, it's just going to be kind of a boring weather pattern. More warm and rain than snow and cold. All right, so I kind of did some lower 48 stuff first. But here's speaking of the tropics, we'll get back to that. This is from 7:40 this morning. I took a snapshot from our Nest Cam that is set up in St. Thomas. Another one of our patrons down there, Tim in St. Thomas, hosts one of our permanent Nest cameras. And look at the waves there. Those were some pretty good waves right there, considering it's coming into the bay here. I think this is Hull Bay, if I am not mistaken. And if I am mistaken, I apologize in advance. But look at that rainbow. It was rainy this morning, probably really humid and, you know, like muggy, I would assume. Look at all that green. Anyhow, that's what's going on down in the tropics. No tropical activity to speak of, obviously, because it's January. Now, on with the traditional outlook part of the video. I try to spice things up a little bit and not make it the same old week after week. So bear with me. These are always also pretty lengthy. One of the nice things, if you like lengthy, in-depth videos, that we can do here is go into great detail. And you can pause it and come back later if you need to, or whatever. We don't have any limitations, even though I should get on with it and start talking. So the Southern Oscillation Index, the SOI, is one of the markers that I like to watch in the off season, even during the hurricane season. In short, to me, the Southern Oscillation Index, which is a measurement, it's just an index, it's not really anything other than how an index is doing. In other words, it's not like it's measuring the amount of something, like the amount of money in a bank account. So we see these numbers, it's just an index. That's all it is. It just tells you how things are going with the pressure differences between Tahiti, way out in the southwest tropical Pacific, and Darwin, which of course is in Australia. And I know if you've heard me say this before, bear with me, so I'll try to make it brief. Basically, when the SOI is sustained negative, and significantly so, usually below -7, numbers that are substantially below -7, that's more of an El Nino type pattern. The way the pressure relationship works, negative equals El Nino, especially strongly and consistently negative. And on the flip side, positive is typically associated with La Nina conditions. And then, as you could deduce, in the middle, around 0, plus or minus either side of 0, just a few points, it's generally neutral. So, that being said, where are we on the Southern Oscillation Index right now? Well, here are the numbers over the last 30, 90, and then today's contributor. Negative, about -5 and, a third or so. Not substantially negative. Even back to October, November, December. November was a little bit below the, that 7 that we talk about, -7. That was -9. Then we came up a little bit in December to -6.72. Bottom line, you can look at it in the tabular format, but also graphically represented. And yes, as of late, early January, we've had this little bit of a rise. That tells me, since we're not just deep diving into negative and staying there, we are not headed towards a rapid El Nino coupling of the atmosphere, at least from this point of view. Some are saying we are, depending on how they look at it. I get that. I'm not arguing with them. I've been tracking this for more than 20 years using the SOI, and it's a very simple thing that when this is consistently negative, and especially deeply so, you usually see the atmosphere couple with the ocean, and you get an El Nino. And we really are not having that right now. And here's a way to prove it. Here are the anomalies. This was updated yesterday. So what happens is when you have lower pressure way over in the far western Pacific, way off this map even, and high pressure in the eastern Pacific, the net flow of air is generally from the high pressure to the low pressure. And that's typical of a positive SOI. When the SOI gets negative, that usually reverses, and you have lower pressures in the east pack, higher pressures way in the west pack, and the net flow of air is generally westerly. Sometimes you get these little bursts of westerly winds with the Madden-Julian oscillation, and you start really getting into some complicated things here called intraseasonal variability. These little pushes over hundreds of miles of the Pacific Ocean, the tropical Pacific, and that can generate some warm pools, and it just all starts to get interconnected. But then you go back to the basics. Okay, well, what's going on? Just open that window. I talk about that analogy a lot. You can look at statistics, you can look at models, but sometimes just open the dadgum window and look out, right? And so we do that. And what do we see? The anomalies in the tropical Pacific through here, the Nino regions as we call it, are a little bit warmer than they should be, but not exceedingly so. And then you can clearly see that. There's a few oranges in here, and that's over here on the scale, but no reds, deep oranges or reds, none of that. And there's a few splotches of blue showing up, which are colder anomalies. But there's plenty of these yellows through here, which is real close to neutral. And so the bottom line, just as at just a glance, you can say, yeah, there's really not much of an El Nino pattern happening in the surface water of the equatorial Pacific. So that is something we track, and we can track that every week, every month, and see how it progresses. On the flip side, look at the Atlantic. Pretty warm down here and a good part of the main development region, especially the far southern portion of it. Kind of chilly right off Africa, near the Canaries, near the Cabo Verde Islands. But the western Atlantic, most of the Caribbean, subtropical Atlantic, and elsewhere, especially here in the Gulf of Mexico, quite a bit above the long-term average. Now, in January, that really doesn't matter much. So we'll just see, does this hang on? I am more interested in this right here. What's happening in the equatorial Pacific region as we go forward? These are the observations, as is this. If this is the surface, this is a slice through the surface. Eastern Pacific over here on the right side, Western Pacific over on the left side. Surface at the top, 450 plus meters at the bottom here of the chart. And what do you got? Kind of like a CAT scan, like I talk about, a slice. So you can see into something. Yeah, there's a lot of upper ocean warmth, definitely. But look at what's happening in the Westpac at depth. That's a pretty large area of -1 Celsius setting up. And this is the future. This would eventually kind of come west with time, east, maybe reach the surface and change everything up again. There's just no definitive push one way or the other in the current conditions to say that we're headed towards an El Nino of any significance or a La Nina, a cooling of the equatorial Pacific of any significance. Now we can look at the modeling and look at it in this graphical format. What does the CPC, Climate Prediction Center, and they work with the Columbia University International Research Institute, and they look at all these different modeling that comes out from the Euro, from the CFS-V2, the JAMSTEC, the Korean, you name it. A lot of modeling out there, and then you can just boil it down again. What's the bottom line? And I really like this representation. The gray is your neutral, and that seems to be prevalent right now. This is where we are in current conditions, as you can see. And going forward, generally speaking, let me get a different color here. The models, this is right about now. My Windows 10 machine behind me talking to me. And this is out in the future. Here's the heart of hurricane season, just to jump ahead. All the way out at the far right-hand side of the chart. That means it's way out in time. Look at what's favored right now. Neutral. El Nino is less than 30% probability, with La Nina there favoring El Nino just by a little bit. But I find it interesting. This is what I look at. How are the trends going? Look at the trend in the blue here. It goes up and up and up. Generally speaking, most of the modeling, and I will preface this statement with another statement, the models are not very good at all forecasting out 6, 7, 8 months. Duh. Okay? You know that. But we look at this and we say, all right, this gives us something to watch. In a sports analogy, it's kind of like saying that a team, and you're going to get mad at me if you're a Tar Heels fan, and this is strictly for educational purposes. At the beginning of the basketball season, the models in this situation, and the metaphor for experts, said that the North Carolina Tar Heel basketball team, the men's team, was a top 10 team. Now, they're out of the top 25 and may not even make the NIT because they're having a horrible season. Nobody could foresee that early on. They looked like they had a good bunch of talent, and it turns out, maybe not so much. All right, how does this work with weather? Same kind of thing. Out in the future, the models are saying, all right, we're favoring neutral, maybe La Nina, but sometimes the modeling can be wrong, just like sometimes experts in other things that we look at, such as sports, and I'm serious, this is how it's related, can also be wrong. And in the case of the Tar Heels, my condolences. All right, that's all I'll say about that. But we'll watch this, and that's the other nice thing about this. This is the early January update. Let's revisit this a month from now in the early February update, and we will compare. Let's see how these change. Does anything gain ground? Which one of these probability areas lose ground? That's, to me, something fascinating that we can watch. All right, trying to speed things up here and get on with it. We looked at anomalies. We looked at some El Nino stuff. And now let's look at actual sea surface temperatures. This continues to boggle my mind. It really does. 80 degrees Fahrenheit or higher all around here. I'm drawing it in black there. In case you hadn't noticed, the sun is going down later. We've already flipped past the solstice, and so the days are getting longer. Incoming solar radiation is increasing again in the northern hemisphere. There's a lag, I know that. It takes time. But until and unless we get major pushes of cold air, what we call cold air advection coming across the Gulf, strong fronts coming down here and really mixing things up, not only with the wind agitation on the Gulf along the surface, but just the cold air itself. Until that happens, this is going to stick around, and it might lead, if it stays long enough, the one concern I would have, well, there's two, for tropical things related, maybe an earlier start to the hurricane season, and that's a stretch. We'll just have to see, because warm water alone doesn't give you hurricanes. We know that. But it's something to watch. And then really the more significant thing is that this would fuel January, February, March, April winter storms, things like that. And then eventually maybe some severe weather in the south, because all of that warm, anomalous, and it is above normal in there, water does equal more energy, more evaporation going on, more moisture, so forth and so on. Along the Atlantic seaboard, same kind of thing. If we go back to the anomaly map, very, very, very warm off the east coast of the U.S. There's the Gulf again right there. So looking at actual sea surface temperatures, nice and toasty in the Gulf Stream, a little chilly on the shelf water as you'd expect. Not that anybody should be going swimming, but hey, when it's 77 degrees here in Wilmington, probably a little chillier on Wrightsville Beach because the ocean is cold. It's like a big old air conditioner sitting out there. I wouldn't blame you if you went and jumped in the ocean, honestly. It's probably about, well, let's zoom in here. What are those isotherms before I get in trouble? And, oh, Mark told me to go swimming. So that's 25, 24, 23, there's 14. So, yeah, it's in, so if 20 degrees is 68, 10 is 50 Celsius, it's about 55 to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's probably a hard no, right? Don't go in the ocean. Anyhow, water temperatures above normal, no nor'easters to take advantage of that just yet, where you get these Miller A or Miller B type storms, depending on how they cut up, either from this way or off the continent. Nothing out here just yet, but the winter is still young, which brings me to lower 48 weather. Now, obviously, hurricanes is my specialty, but I like to keep you weather aware, because if you're prepared for hurricanes, you're prepared for anything, generally. At least that's the way it should be. So right now in the nation's northwest corner, that's where most of the action is of winter weather down here in the southeast, especially the heart of Dixie, Mississippi through Alabama, Georgia, flood watches, even some warnings down here. Why are we seeing that? Well, let's take a look at the national radar, and you get an idea. It's hard to see the wintry weather, but it's out here in the again, the Rockies and beyond to the Pacific Northwest. But down here in the warm portion, got this slow-moving frontal boundary through here. Very heavy rainfall over the same areas. And, part of that is because of this very warm Gulf. The moisture is pulled up out of the warm Gulf of Mexico into this frontal boundary, and it's able to rain. You have much higher precipitable water values because of that. Now, when is it going to change? I figured this is a real easy way to demonstrate this. Here's a look at the lower 48. Here's just real quick the East Coast, Carolinas. There's Florida, the Gulf Coast, down to the Yucatan. There's Mexico, Baja Peninsula, California, and so forth. Right now, in this pattern, everything's almost zonal, right? It's like from the Pacific across the United States. No longitudinal deep troughs. Not yet. So I think that's going to change, and so do a lot of other people. And we can just look at the modeling and other factors, and you can see it's coming. Here's the initial map. Here's 24, 48, 72 hours out. Now, that's a pretty... You're going to have some warm weather up in parts of Canada and the nation's midsection north of Minnesota, troughiness out west. But watch what happens. That's 72 hours. There's 96. Now the cold air starts to come in. This is what I was talking about. There's your energy dropping in out of Canada. The jet stream buckles. And at day 5, it swings through the northeast. Colder. Great Lakes, big-time lake effect snows coming. Wind, you name it, and a return to serious cold. And that starts to take root more and more by day 6 and day 7. Indications are more ridging out west with troughing and cold in the east, which, if you get the southern stream involved, maybe will lead to some winter storms for the East Coast. We'll just have to wait and see about that, won't we? All right, if you are on Patreon, please log in. Check it out if you got the app. It's on Android or iOS, the Patreon app. I've been doing this podcast series since December the 4th. Stories from the Hurricane Highway. It's an audio podcast all the way up through the year 1999 now. It's a retrospective of how I got into this, and it's just talking, just telling you stories. And the feedback I have received so far has been very positive. So if you're already on Patreon, check it out. If you're not on Patreon, this is a good reason to join. At the $1 level, you get access to this. There's no restrictions, as well as a host of other things. So check it out on Patreon. And then coming up, I'm working on this. It's quite a chore. It is the original series. It's a TV-type series, and it is called The Hurricane Highway. And the very first episode, the pilot episode of this, basically it's going to replace the Tracking the Hurricanes long format movies, if you will, the documentary-type films, with a web series of 8 episodes, I believe I'll be cranking out this year. Season 1 of The Hurricane Highway. And the pilot episode, episode 1, called The First Miles, will be ready by February 10th. It's a little later than I wanted because I've got to get some interviews in. That's the thing about it. It's going to have a lot more of that interview format instead of almost everything being done with voiceover. Nothing wrong with that. I like my previous productions, but I'm trying to change things up, make it a little bit different, make it more appealing to more people, so we're getting more interviews with people involved. And so what it'll be is a look back at the 2019 hurricane season, but in what we call a long burn. It's going to take 8 episodes to do so, and we will use flashbacks, experts dropping in and out, somebody that you'll see if you're on Patreon. This will drop on Patreon probably the first week of February, certainly by February 10th, and then about every 2 weeks thereafter, a new episode, which will include, of course, Dorian in the United States. No, we did not go to the Bahamas for that, as well as the last episode, which will drop in May, a typhoon in the Philippines that we covered. Our good friend Brent went over there, and everything in between. So that's what I'm working on myself. Interviews, music, writing, editing, and it's all done on a laptop. And no production assistance. It can be mind-bogglingly... Is that a word? It is now. It's quite a chore, but I'm not complaining. I feel really privileged that I get to do this for you guys right here. Our patrons, they are my Netflix. They're my base, as are our HurricaneTrack Insider subscribers, our members, our crowdfunding group. You guys are the ones that I'm doing this for, and I can't wait to show you. It's in the works, and it's coming along really well. I'm really happy about it. All right, so that's coming up. I am on Twitter as well, at HurricaneTrack. I don't know what happened. I'm screwing things up here as I try to sign out. So I'll just finish. Why don't I? I'll be back with you next week. By the way, the third part of the 1999 discussion on stories of the Hurricane Highway drops tomorrow evening. Every Wednesday, a new podcast episode. Just a reminder there. Have a good rest of your week ahead. I am Mark Sudduth. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. For HurricaneTrack.com, that's my site. Check it out if you haven't already. I'm sure you already know that. Hey, look, I'll be back with you next week. Thanks for tuning in. We'll chat again in about a week.